Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for people that are online. Great to see everybody here. So I work for Shell. I've been with Shell for over 20 years. I am a SANS ICS 410 instructor and love to present and share some of the great things that we're doing in our organization and give it back to the community. So most of us in this room have been involved or will be involved or have contributed to some kind of cybersecurity initiatives in our organizations, right? Whether it's following CIS, right, Center for Internet Security, IEC, top 5 controls, whatever it might be, right? Maybe you follow IEC 62443, right, trying to implement changes and improvements in your environments. Maybe you're a vendor and you're creating tools, right, for the user community. Maybe you're a contractor, right, consultant, right, working on these projects. So there's lots of buzzwords, lots of things that have existed over time, right? We've talked about some of them. Next door, there's a lot of great tools, right? Network security monitoring, great firewalls, right? User awareness training, tabletop exercises, log management, cyber hygiene, right? Data diodes, unidirectional gateways. There's all these kind of buzzwords, right, in the industry and initiatives, right, that help us cyber secure our critical infrastructure. That's all great. We should still continue it and do it continuously. But in my work around the world, I've noticed a huge gap, and that is the operator, right? The operator is usually left out of a lot of these initiatives. And when I define operator, I consider it the person that sits in front of the console, right? The console operator that is doing a night shift at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? In your CCB, your central control building, right, in your facility. That's kind of my definition of operator when I interface people. I go to the people that are on the panels, right, acknowledging the alarms and everything else, okay? And so the goal here is to show you some of the things that we're doing in our organization and at our joint ventures, bolting on or dovetailing into existing processes that exist in the field and putting a cyber element into it and improving how operations is aware of cyber and their abilities to respond to cybersecurity. So in the tabletop exercises that I do, the big picture on the left-hand side is a great video, 90-second video. I don't want to play it here, but it's on YouTube. It's an active attack from the 2014 Ukraine power grid attack. And it's 90 seconds. It's awesome. I use it in all my training, all my executive type of presentations to show what a real cybersecurity attack is, where the adversarial threat uses VNC to try to shut down switchgear and the switchgear in Ukraine. Okay, so it shows from an operational standpoint what a cyber attack looks like. It's called the phantom mouse attack because the engineer who took the video on an older phone, he zooms back and he says, I'm not controlling anything, right? And there's total confusion from the operator and the mouse is not moving because they used IT software to get access into one of their HMIs. And then you have WannaCry, you have NotPetya, and then some other ransomware, right, example. So when I go to the console operators, and I say, what would you do, right, if you had this type of, if this happened, right, to your engineering workstation or your HMI? You'd be surprised at the answers that you would get. An operator would say, I would do an emergency shutdown. Somebody else pipes in, no, you wouldn't, because we're making $1 million a day. We're still operating in a safe environment. I would wait for a high critical alarm that I have to acknowledge. Other operators would say, we would go into local control. Other people would say, I would look at this standard operating procedure, try to find out, some information on how I could resolve it. I would call IT. It's the vendor's problem. Let's call the vendor, right? They're responsible for it, right? You get a multitude of answers, right, from the operators, right, when you do a tabletop exercise. Well, that's concerning when it's a hypothetical situation. What if it actually happens? You don't want your operators arguing on their response, right, in the field, right, when something like this happens. So this is where these toolbox talks that we'll talk about in the next section here really add value, right, to raise awareness. But the operator, right, some kind of critical facts about operations and operators, the logging in our ICS leaves a lot to be desired, right? Rob yesterday used a harsher word. He said dismal, okay? So it is improving over time, but we don't still have full visibility of what's going on in our critical environments. And the operators, they live and breathe the process. So Gabriel, in the presentation before, he said what we would see from the network, but the operator will also see all the alarms, right? The process, the values, right? How well the process is actually operating. They live and breathe the process. They know what the asset should be doing and what normal and abnormal processes operate at. So we have to rely on them and their knowledge as well to tell us, the support organization, and with the skill set, with the tools to be able to find out what abnormal is. And the operations organization, the operators are still in control of the process, right? So they make the judgment call if they have to go into a safe shutdown or if they have to shut down a particular unit because it's producing hydrocarbons or some type of acid or whatever it might be, right? So they have to make the judgment calls. They have to be on our team, on one team, to respond to a cybersecurity incident. And so this is very common in tabletop exercises when you ask operators, what would you do? What would be the escalation path? Who would you call? Usually you get deer in headlights, type of response, right, from operators. They're not in the circle that they need to be in. So what is a toolbox talk, right? So the top picture there is me at an asset, and I'm showing them the 90-second clip in the upper right-hand corner during a shift changeover. This is what a cybersecurity attack could look like in your facility, right? Here's a picture of ransomware. Do you know what to do, right? And then they look around, they're like, and then you get those kind of crazy answers, right? I would I would do the ESD button, or I would call the vendor, right, for support, et cetera, which wastes a lot of time in our response capabilities. So the toolbox talk is a short meeting, 10 or 15 minutes, that every discipline does at an operating asset. The middle picture is electricians talking about in their shack, what is going on? What's the lockout, tagout for the day? What are we doing? Are we doing pulling cable? Are we energizing? Are we terminating? And they talk about what the plan is for the day, what hazards exist, just kind of recalling safe practices and just continuously raising their awareness on different risks, in their particular disciplines. And then the bottom picture there, that's guys eating some breakfast tacos in the canteen before they head out to the make ready site. So, and these toolbox talks are really easy, right? I'll show you exactly what I do in those it's like 2 or 3 slides, okay? So the material is easy. You could easily do it next week if you really wanted to. Get in front of your operators and show them a particular attack and just kind of throw out the question, what would you actually do in this type of scenario? So what could be an indication that an indication of a cybersecurity attack that an operator would pick up that our network tools might not pick up, right? Because of a lack of logging and a multitude of other reasons, right? Well, maybe a slow PC, maybe slow graphics, right, on your faceplates, maybe suspicious lapse in value displays, maybe there's abnormal software being installed, right? Maybe your alarms are off, right? Maybe you have excessive alarms or suppression of alarms. The operators know which alarms are nuisance alarms, what normal is, and all of a sudden, if there's a variation in that, something's not right in the process, in the asset, right? Maybe some logs on your sequence of events, right, are missing, right, have been deleted. Maybe trips, right? There's excessive trips, right, in your process units. Maybe the polling rates change. Maybe you see the phantom mouse, right? Very apparent. So these are all things that operators, would be able to pick up that some of our tools might not be able to pick up. So I asked, this is exactly the slide that I used in those toolbox talks. What would you do, right, in that particular situation? Do you have an operating procedure to deal with a cybersecurity incident? Right? And usually it's no. Right? There's a few verticals like nuclear, actually they do have, right? They actually kick off parallel investigations from an operational standpoint, and from a cyber perspective, they kick off investigations to investigate abnormal behavior, because you don't want the operators to have a whole bunch of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? Because it could be a calibration issue, it could be a field instrument failure, right? A bus failure, all kinds of other things. But at the back of their mind, the operator should understand that in a rare possibility, it could be a cyber attack in their environment, and just be cognizant of that, right? They should be aware that it could happen in their lifetime. So if that happens, right, if you have a phantom mouse or ransomware, well, you should maybe, you should investigate it. You don't want to take a video of it and put it on socials. You don't want to ignore it. You want to call people, call your vendor, call your shift manager, right? Call other units possibly, right? If it's a big facility, you might want to call the other control room and say, hey, we're seeing something that we've never seen before, right? Be aware of it, right? Do some investigation on your end, because, we have a situation on our unit, right? Terminate certain permits to work, right? Maybe put other people on standby, right? Call operators out from the field if you're concerned, right? Because going out into the field is a risky proposition. There's HSSE risk out there. So yeah, lots of different things, right? Do not make premature conclusions. Don't raise your hand and say, yeah, we're under attack, right? You got to do your due diligence and figure out what exactly it is. So after the toolbox talk, you will hopefully have some action items to say, hey, we have no procedure. There's a whole bunch of confusion with our operators on what we would actually do. So this is where a standard operating procedure and a work instruction comes in. Okay, so this is standard operating procedure, provides kind of standardized guidelines and routines for operators to at an asset, right, to ensure consistency on how they operate the asset. So this example is from an integrity outside window and design outside window instructions. So in a refinery, there's lots of high pressure, high temperature kind of situations. And if you're operating at a higher level that is actually intended by your operators, by the design, that becomes an integrity issue. And then if you exceed that even further, then it gets into a design issue where you're running the equipment outside of the design envelope from a pressure temperature perspective. And operators have a procedure for that, right? It's outlined exactly how they need to deal with it, where the reporting has to go, how it's handed over to the next shift if they don't get it resolved. There's certain time estimations on time exceedances, on what they need to do, et cetera, right, on this standard operating procedure. And usually in the back of the control room, they will have almost, a hard copy library of all these different standard operating procedures. If there's a black start, right, if there's a trip, if all of a sudden you have to suppress or inhibit or force a whole bunch of alarms when you're doing startup or whatever it might be, there's a standard operating procedure and work instructions to tell the operator how to do it to not put the asset in jeopardy, okay? So we've kind of tried to dovetail cybersecurity and an operator response, right, to create an OT cybersecurity incident investigation and response work instruction that outlines what an operator should do if there's a cyber threat in their control room or on their devices, right, on the system that they're operating. And so what are some of the things that we need to think about or that could go into a standard operating procedure? Well, you need to define what a cybersecurity incident is. Is ransomware on one machine an incident, or can you operate the plant in a safe manner? Is that a big deal to you? So, depending on your process, depending on how your network is architected, right? Some of the operators will say, I don't care about that machine. It's just one machine, right? We're still operating safe, right, in the field. Let's turn down this machine and rebuild it. It's no big deal, right? Blah, 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 right? But, in other situations, right, if it's a safety system, yeah, that would be concerning, right? So you have to be process aware whenever you create these standard operating procedures. Some of our processes are really complex, like a petrochemical unit, there's tight loops and things change. And you don't want to be making an adverse effect and then having something down the line, right? Or your feedstock being impacted and, it creates a whole bunch of alarms down the line in your process. So you need to have these conversations with your operational people and get support from your asset manager, production manager on how to respond. And when you do respond, maybe you should have two or more people determine and make the call, right, on how to respond. So if there is ransomware in your IT network and things are going blue screen, maybe the right procedure at your facility is to disconnect from the IT network, right, and isolate OT, go into island mode or turtle mode, whatever you want to call it. But you have to understand the risk, right? Yes, your historical Pi data will cease to exist. Maybe remote access will go down, right? You know, you have to understand what the ramifications are of doing certain things in your facility, right? And then you have two or more people, so then you can't point the finger and say it's your fault, it's your blame, and you know, there's actually been a little bit more thought, you know, expended, right, to make the right call at the right time in a particular situation. Yes, you might have a firewall and other equipment, but what about, you know, your HA, your high availability equipment, right? You would have to, you know, understand that network architecture. A lot of operators don't have physical access, right, into the telco or into the rack rooms, right? They have access in their control room, but they can't get into the server racks, right? So what if this happens at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and they decide to take some action, and they can't physically get into the room to pull some cables and disconnect or power down certain systems, right? You have to consider that. Regulatory requirements, that's another ball of wax, right? Won't get into that. Clarity on roles and responsibilities. Do you have somebody on retainer that will help you, right, in incident response, right? What is their number? What's the contracts, right? How does this whole process this standard operating procedure, how does that roll up into your overall response process? Okay, so lots of things to think about when you create these documents and flush out you know, the standard operating procedure for operators. The goal here is not for the operator to do the troubleshooting. They're not cybersecurity professionals like we are, right? But they need to know what a cyber attack could look like and call the right person. There should be no hesitation to escalate and kick off parallel investigations and get the right people involved at the right time. You don't want them to be in analysis paralysis, you know, with a whole bunch of infighting between the operators before they call head office or somebody that is competent to help them do the PCAPs and all the stuff that Gabriel was talking about in the previous presentation. All right. So other ways, right, to dovetail cyber into existing operational processes at assets. There's a permit to work process. So this is a systematic process to authorize controlled work in non-standard or non-routine, potentially hazardous conditions. So whenever there's work being done, this is an example from a commissioning kind of yard that we had. Probably it'll be hard to see for people in the back, but this is where the work unit will sit down at their morning session with their coffee and say, okay, what are we doing? Is there confined space work? Do we have to drive into the site? Right? Is there any, you know, special PPE that we need to work that we need to take in? Is there, you know, what exactly are we doing? Do we have to worry about line of fire issues, right? Pinch points, right? Working at heights, right? All those types of things. And so we've actually incorporated OT cyber into that permit to work process. So in this particular situation, right, they're driving into the yard, they're going to be climbing up, you know, some stairs. There's SimOps, which is simultaneous operations. You have to be aware of other work units in the field, right? There could be some hot work, right, that's going on. You have to be cognizant of all the other risks that are going on with the welders, pipe fitters, etc. Okay. And so over here, they're commissioning and turning up and energizing a whole bunch of equipment. So they're going to be using their laptops. They might have to have some USB devices, right, to bring in some tools, right, some images, whatever it might be. And so they actually have a checklist. If we're bringing in a laptop to do the work in our confined space in a particular, you know, area of the plant, we want to make sure that that laptop is scanned and take some additional steps to make sure that we're not bringing in malware into our environment. So lots of things to think about, but this is very easy to do because the existing processes already exist, right, in many of our facilities. So what about learning from incidents, right? So most mature organizations will have a process in place to learn from incidents. So if there's a motor vehicle accident on site, if somebody's hand gets cut, right? If there's somebody falls on and injures themselves, if there's mechanical failure, if there's corrosion under insulation, whatever it might be, there's usually an LFI that is produced in our organizations, mature organizations, learning from incidents. And so there's usually a database, or there should be a database, right, that outlines your target audience, whether it's operations, whether it's a maintenance issue, maybe it's a project issue. What exactly happened with pictures, right? How did that person get injured? How did that turbine blade get bent, right? What was the root cause of it? There's usually an investigation, what exactly happened. There's lessons learned, right? Maybe we didn't do preventative maintenance, et cetera, all right, in the field. And then recommendations on how to improve the processes to make sure that it doesn't happen, or at least reduce the likelihood that that will not happen again. And then there's usually some further information and contact person details for that particular LFI. Well, if you're an owner operator, I guarantee you that you've had a near miss or some kind of cyber incident in your OT network, okay? And so my question to you is, have you actually documented it? Have you got some learnings from your OT ICS cybersecurity incident in your organizations, right? Have you fed that back into the organization, to your other assets? Is it recorded? Is it socialized, right? Is it understood, right? And start those, start that process, right? Make sure that all the mistakes that you have done are not missed, and the learnings are not, make sure that the learnings are put forward to make your organization that much more secure. So whenever we have a cybersecurity incident or a near miss, we try to author an LFI and put it into the database. And then we actually try to pull on that when we do cybersecurity risk assessments and have some data points on how, the near misses and the incidents that we have had in our organizations, okay? So questions to ask of, the people, usually there's dedicated people that do this in larger organizations, right? That are, champions, right, of this process. So does the system, I assume that is going to be an automated system, does the system even have a drop-down menu, right? That you can actually log an ICS cybersecurity incident into the LFI database that you might have, or the process that you might have. Right? Does your system, and then you have to kind of develop a whole kind of training rigor and training program for the people, all right, for them to be able to report those types of incidents. So what else? Management of change is a big deal. So whenever you're doing a major project at a facility, there's a management of change process. So it ensures, this is a fairly light definition of management of change, process to ensure changes are managed in a manner that new risks are not unknowingly incurred without proper mitigation. Mike and I did a presentation yesterday about the FAT-SAT. You do not want to be commissioning, bringing new systems into your environment that are cyber insecure, right? Very hard to hand them over to operations and fix security issues in an operating capacity, right? You want to make sure that you're procuring, designing, deploying, commissioning secure ICS systems in our environment. So if you're rolling out some kind of tablet, there was a wireless question before, right? If you're doing tablets, right? These little tablets are HMI tablets, using 802.11, right? You definitely want to do some kind of management of change. You do not want to have these things show up in your environment without your knowledge or without security people being involved in the discussion to make sure that they're configured in a secure manner, that the architecture is done. Because guaranteed, the vendor and the asset want those things, and they'll do them even if you're not involved. Okay, you'll be surprised at some of the stuff that you see when you go to an asset. Where did that come from, right? Nobody told me that was being deployed, right? So there's lots of different things that can change, right, in your environment that you should have a pulse on, that because they do pose a significant risk to your organization. So when you're adding new devices, when you're doing a brownfield project, right, you're replacing certain servers, right, with the latest supportable service. When you're going to a hypervisor, right, environment, etc. Remote access architecture changes. You definitely want to be in that discussion. You do not want those things to be changing without your knowledge. And this is where the whole management of change process comes in, to make sure that the right people are engaged at the right time to make those calls and to make sure that cybersecurity is built into your deployments. So challenges, this is challenging, right? This is not easy, right? When you're at an asset, things go at a very high pace, right? It's and things just get done between different departments, and getting your hands and getting those personal connects with the people and getting cybersecurity built into the management of change process. This is very well ironed out when you're replacing a valve or you're replacing a pipe, right? Or some kind of field instrument, right? The management of change process works for that very well generally, but from a cybersecurity perspective, not so well. So you want to make sure, right, that you're at the discussion table when all these new things are changing, like these firewall rules, etc. You want to make sure that all of a sudden, because of troubleshooting issues, and any rule is not put into that firewall and left because it's lunchtime and guys want their brisket. All right. So yeah, that's a challenge. So some closing thoughts, right? Whatever you're doing now, don't drop it. Finish whatever projects, right? If you're, if you're cleaning up your firewall rules, if you're deploying a network security monitoring tool, right? Whether you're patching, right, upgrading, right, to server 2022, whatever it might be, don't halt your projects. Finish those projects. But I challenge you to start thinking about how you can get your operations and your operators more involved by dovetailing some of these simple steps that I outlined in the last few slides. So, and the toolbox talk, right? A lot of the content in these conferences is like, oh my God, how am I going to incorporate, or how am I going to do this in my organization, right? It's a little bit daunting, but you got to break it down, right? So what can you do next week? Well, I gave you the toolbox talk slides, right? If you're working at an asset, you could just copy my slide and do a 15-minute toolbox talk with your operators tomorrow or next week, right? This week you're here, you're traveling, you're trying to get on some of the rides, etc., right? But next week you could easily you or one of your team members could kick off a quick 15-minute toolbox talk during a shift change, right? That's a given. Authoring a standard operating procedure, that's going to take a little bit more time, right? So you might have to do a kickoff, and then you have to kind of work it, right? It's not something that you can do in a week or hand it over to operations, right? Operators are busy operating the plant. It's going to be a bit of an initiative, right? It's not as easy, right, to do that. You got to take a human factors approach to the initiatives here that we're doing, all right? You do not want to create additional work for your operators, right? Your operators are busy as it is dealing with alarms, acknowledging the critical alarms, and looking at the board, right? So whenever you implement anything from a work instruction perspective or adding to it, you do not want to create a bunch of work, because it's not going to be sustainable, right? So you have to do incremental changes that are almost insignificant to the operator, because they're busy, with their day job, right? You do not want to be adding cybersecurity work, right, to the operator, okay? And then you need to make sure a lot of assets will have training programs. So if you do make a tweak, then incorporate that into your operator training plans. So once you do have an SOP, then incorporate it into their training programs. Most operators will have to go through a recertification process. So make sure that that is embedded into the training programs. It's not a fire and forget it type of activity. You want to make sure that it's embedded, that it's sustainable, that new people coming into the organization are trained up on those particular approved work instructions and SOPs, and then continuously perform and test it and continuously improve it. So perform those tabletop exercises to make sure that the operators and the interaction, the connective tissue between your operators and your OT support staff and IT actually work, right, in your organization. All right, so with that, we have a few more minutes for some Q&A.